Hi guys, I'm Griffin. I'm a student ambassador with Appalachian State's Office of Sustainability.
Hey everybody, my name is Tun, and I am a Senior Sustainability Ambassador at the Office of Sustainability on campus. Thank you so much for watching our video, and we'll get right into it.
This is the first video we're doing in a series that's going to cover the complicated topics of politics and climate change and how they interact. There's a lot of talk about these issues right now because of the new administration, and it can be pretty hard to keep track of everything that's going on, so we figured a few videos covering the basic aspects of the issues might help clear things up a little bit. In this first video, we're going to be covering the history of politics and climate change and how they've interacted in the United States. We're mostly going to be focusing on the last half of the 20th century, as before that point, climate was not really an issue discussed much in politics. To start things off, let's take a dive into the 1950s. Now, at the beginning of the 50s, and in fact throughout most of the decade, climate change was not really an issue at the forefront of politics or even American society. Now, some scientists were absolutely concerned already about the potential effects of industrialization and climate change, but the American public and even the government were not really concerned about it as a long-term issue, and most people weren't even aware of it. Now, in terms of politics in the US government taking action on climate, throughout most of the 50s, the focus was pretty much entirely on pollution, and in fact on individual acts of pollution and cleanup, as opposed to systemic problems of pollution from the industrial sector. The most important action that Eisenhower took during his 2 terms in office was the passage of the Air Pollution Control Act. This was the first federal law that regulated air pollution and what can be put into the atmosphere. It was not the strongest law that would ever be passed, and mostly left the duties of regulation up to the individual states, while the federal government would provide funding for such efforts. However, it was the landmark because it was the first time the federal government had acknowledged that air pollution was an issue and steps should be taken to prevent it. Despite this development, however, there was fairly little action in the areas of climate change, pollution, and sustainability from the government during the 1950s. It was not until public pressure increased after the environmentalist movement really came into its own in the early 1960s that the government would begin to take more concrete action. To tell you more about this, I'm going to pass things over to my partner.
The 60s is a time period that could be considered a seed planting era of environmental policy and politics. What I mean by this is we're looking at the Clean Water Act, Solid Waste Disposal Act, and the release of books such as Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. These are essentially pins in history that we can look back on as these are catalysts, and these are the first stepping stones that people are making in the United States towards quality of their environment in general.
Now we're going to be addressing the 1970s. The 1970s are one of, if not the most important decades for climate change and politics in the history of the United States. This was a time when multiple administrations from both parties prioritized climate change and sustainability as issues and worked hard to improve the regulations and power of the United States to prevent pollution and other abuses of the environment. Let's take a look into it. Richard Nixon was president of the United States from 1968 until 1974, and while his legacy is controversial due to a number of political scandals, he's actually considered a landmark in terms of taking the issues of climate change and pollution very seriously and taking concrete steps to combat them. He passed a number of very important acts during his tenure, many of which are still the bedrock of regulations against pollution and preservation of the environment in the United States today. Let's take a closer look at some of the big ones. The Clean Air Act of 1970 is one of the most important acts that Nixon passed, and it's still foundational to the regulation of air pollution in the United States today. It provided the first strong federal enforcement of pollution regulations regarding air pollutants and what can be put into the air by industrial sites. It has been modified and updated over the years to keep it concurrent with guidelines, but Nixon was the first one to pass it in 1970, and before that, air pollution was almost, not quite, but almost the Wild West in terms of what you were allowed to do and what you weren't. Also passed the National Environmental Policy Act. This act required every federal building project to conduct an environmental impact survey to see what the negative environmental consequences of building that might be. Everything from a parking lot to an office building to a military testing site has to make one of these impact reports now. And if the damage is found to be excessive or unwarranted, then that project will have to either modify itself to do less damage to the environment or will have to be scrapped. Perhaps the most important thing that Nixon did in the areas of climate and pollution during his time in office was to create the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. This is a federal government body that is charged with enforcing all federal emissions and pollution controls and punishing anyone who breaks those laws. Now, this was important primarily because previously these regulations had been left to other federal law enforcement agencies to enforce, and they were mostly focused on other areas. The EPA was able to focus on areas of pollution, climate change, etc., and perform that job in a much more efficient manner in making these regulations that Nixon had passed and the acts we previously discussed much more impactful and important than they would have been otherwise. Following Nixon's resignation during the Watergate scandal of 1974, his vice president, Gerald Ford, took over. Ford, unlike Nixon, did not focus much on the climate during his time in office. He was only in office for a few short years, and during that time he focused primarily on restoring trust in the government that was damaged during Nixon's administration, and on rebuilding the economy, which was at a weak spot during that time period. Ford didn't completely ignore the climate, though. In 1974, he passed the Safe Drinking Water Act, which, as the name implies, regulated the amount of pollutants and contaminants within public drinking water systems to safe levels that would not harm Americans just by drinking them. If you ask me, I think that's pretty important. In 1976, President Ford also passed the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, which is the main law in the United States governing things like recycling collection, trash collection and disposal, things along those lines, generally the area of disposing of waste and reusing reusable materials. And it's very important to have federal laws governing things like that, because if an issue like that is left to the states, you get uneven and unequal laws, different handling of certain materials, and Ford did away with that by establishing a common federal law over the land. In 1976, Jimmy Carter was elected, and this marks a real turning point in the history of politics and climate change because Carter was one of the first presidents, arguably the first, to really truly campaign on the issue of climate, sustainability, and pollution control. By the 1970s, the environmentalist movement had really gotten off the ground and was truly becoming a widespread movement within the population of the United States. Climate was now at the forefront of people's minds, and it showed. By electing Carter to office, they elected what many called the first environmentalist president. Carter had a very strong environmental agenda and made lots of big promises during his campaign, but due to difficulties working with both Republicans and with Democrats in Congress, he was unable to get his agenda through and pass everything into law that he hoped for. However, he did still take many important steps. Perhaps the most well-known one was placing solar panels on the roof of the White House as a new renewable energy source, though unfortunately they were removed after he left office. In the legislative arena, Carter managed some pretty impressive accomplishments despite his difficulties in Washington. One of these accomplishments was the passage of the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act. This is the main law that governs surface mining, like strip mining in the United States, which previously had been almost entirely unregulated. It sets strict guidelines to prevent excessive pollution, as this is one of the most polluting ways of mining resources, and can destroy entire mountainsides in the process. Carter set up strict regulations to help clamp down on the unnecessary pollution involved in surface mining and avoid unnecessary damage and set the stage for rebuilding the mountainsides after the mining was completed. Carter also created the Department of Energy, which is a cabinet-level position in the White House. The Department of Energy studies energy consumption and production with the United States, both from renewable and non-renewable sources. It is not strictly focused on climate change or the environment, but by studying energy consumption rates and how we can use more renewable energy sources to offset non-renewable sources that produce large amounts of carbon, the department has taken a role in studying the U.S.'s impact on global climate change and how we can best mitigate that, which are some very important steps.
As we move into the 80s, which is the Reagan administration, it's essentially a step back from the past decade that we were in, because he had a skepticism for environmental protection laws, and he actively campaigned against government regulation regarding environmental policies. He lowered the EPA budget. There was employee cuts, essentially dismantling the EPA that was put in place that past year in the 70s, the past decade in the 70s. Reagan also kind of moved and shifted the language from environmental protection to a cooperative regulation, where private companies were required to, quote unquote, review the regulations and opt to participate, but there wasn't much backing behind when these regulations were overstepped or not followed. Essentially, the Reagan administration is completely uprooting what was planted in the 60s. So where these acts were put in place, there was a reversal 20 years later. Where these regulations were being introduced, they were just essentially looked over.
Now we're getting into the 1990s. At the start of the decade, the president was George Bush Sr., formerly President Reagan's vice president. Bush Sr. did not focus particularly on climate change during his term in office. He primarily was focused on other foreign policy issues as well as the economy. He did pass an amendment to the Clean Air Act, originally passed by Richard Nixon, but aside from that, achieved very little and actually was an obstacle towards global efforts to combat climate change when, in a conference in Rio, he refused to commit the United States to protecting biodiversity or to attempt to limit global emissions of carbon dioxide. So Bush's legacy in the area of climate is something of a mixed bag, according to most experts on the subject. In the 1992 presidential election, Bill Clinton defeated George W. Bush and assumed the presidency, which he would hold for the rest of the decade. Clinton took more aggressive action on climate change, although still moderate by most modern standards. He also focused increasingly on combating climate change and pollution internationally, which was a big focus of the environmentalist movement during the 90s, as it was realized that climate change is truly a global issue, and the nations of the world had to come together if they were going to present a unified, effective solution. Clinton pushed hard for his Climate Change Action Plan, which he debuted in 1993. This plan, among many other things, would have imposed a tax on non-renewable energy producers based on the efficiency of their energy productions using a unit called the BTU, or the British Thermal Unit. It gets kind of into complex sciencey stuff here, but essentially it's just a measurement of how effective a heating source is, since non-renewable sources tend to have a high emission output compared to their heat production. This tax would have been most effective at subsidizing renewable energy sources and taxing non-renewable sources for their impact on the environment. Clinton also established the Clean Air Partnership Fund, which was a $200 million fund designed to help local governments and environmental regulatory agencies combat air pollution. In fact, this was a theme throughout much of Clinton's presidency. He attempted to use the power and influence of the federal government he was in charge of to help both businesses, the private industry, and state and local governments, smaller governments that are more in touch with on-the-ground issues, to fight climate change and pollution at home. Lastly, perhaps the crowning achievement of Clinton's administration in the area of climate was the signing of the Kyoto Accord. In 1997, representatives from nations all around the world met in the Japanese city of Kyoto to sign an accord quite similar to the modern Paris Climate Accord. It was a non-binding commitment to each nation to reduce carbon emissions by a certain amount specific to them, based on their level of development and current level of emissions. The United States pledged that it would reduce its carbon emissions by 7%. The Senate was very reluctant to endorse the United States signing of the Kyoto Accord, and in fact issued a statement saying that they were opposed to it. However, under Clinton's advice, the United States still did sign it. However, without the participation of Congress, it was unfortunately unable to ratify the treaty. But the United States sent the message that as a signatory, it was still committed to fighting climate change in a global partnership with the other nations of the world.
So as we move into the 2000s, we look back on the half century that we've covered, and you kind of see this push-pull pattern where you take a step forward in environmental policy and then you take a big jump back. And a lot of this is due to the polarization of environmental policy based upon politics. There's a social belief or social norm essentially for what a certain which way a person leans also will affect their beliefs upon environmental policy, which should be an opinion that is isolated from politics, as it essentially covers the space that we habitat, but due to the nature of politics and history, we've seen that that is not the case. But moving back into the 2000s, we're looking at the Bush administration, and for me personally, I see these acts that he pushed for and this administration in general as very performative. Performative in the sense that they are pushing for like the Great Lakes Legacy Act. This is cleaning up contamination and pollution in the Great Lakes. And then there's the brownfields legislation, and brownfields are essentially old sites of industrial buildings and dump sites. And there's a Healthy Forest Initiative, Clear Skies Initiative, but all of these initiatives and acts are reactionary. These are things that should already have been done because damage was put onto the environment, and within the past years, there was no administration addressing it or being accountable for it. So Bush, his administration essentially stepped up and had to, mostly due to social pressures. Again, we look that the United States has opted out for the Kyoto Protocol. So in conclusion of our past half century that we've covered, we end on a note in the right direction, which kind of, helps us move forward to where we are today in 2021. The agenda, or the if you look at the official sustainability website, which we'll put in the link below, will have goals of ultimately what is the sole purpose of pursuit of sustainability. And due to these historical events that has led our current policies to reflect addressing issues in the past that were essentially, there wasn't enough knowledge or there wasn't enough pushback by the environmental community. But that's where we are today. That's what we have grown into. But thank you guys so much for watching this video. Please like, subscribe, and share. We're on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram. We super appreciate the support, and we're always happy to see people jumping in our Zoom meetings, our little activities we have due to, the pandemic that we're going through. But that doesn't mean that we're looking to engage with students that are really interested in environmental issues and overall sustainability on our campus. So I hope to see you all again sometime soon. Thanks. Bye.